Surprisingly, this is not a simple question. By most measures, productivity at work has increased dramatically over the past 30 years. Businesses now make much more at a better quality level, using less resources and producing less waste than they ever have. But identifying the labour component of this productivity is not easy. Much of the reason for increased productivity is technological. Not only are we now capable of creating machines which can be programmed to efficiently produce virtually anything we need, but our increased understanding of the way in which the world works allows us to produce much more using less resources and with less waste than ever before. For people at work, however, the productivity equation is not so clear-cut. At one level, technology and the shift towards the management of information means workplaces are becoming safer and less physically threatening, for most people at least. There's actually a paradox here, and one that troubles me quite a bit. On one hand, work is becoming less physically demanding. More than 2/3 of workers in the developed world are now only involved in the management and manipulation of information. At the same time, the world's population is ageing. There will be more people aged over 65 in the developed world than aged under 15 for the first time in history, probably this year. This increase in life expectancy is accompanied by greater mental and physical health. Australians, for example, spend half of their lifetime health costs in the last 18 months of their lives. Yet, in my home country at least, there is a marked reluctance to hire older workers. A recent survey of human resources practitioners in Australia revealed that not one of them would hire a 55-year-old into a significant corporate role. Not one. We in the West have foolishly forgotten what David Suzuki called in one of his books, wisdom of the elders, and what indigenous peoples across the world have known for centuries, that wisdom is only gained through life experience. It is folly to believe that improving productivity at work only means hiring young people who are prepared to commit themselves to nothing but their job and work unbelievably long hours. In an era where jobs were physically demanding and wore our bodies out over time, this might have been defensible. In the information age, there is in fact a powerful argument for retaining those with experience in order to retain what is called organisational memory. After many rounds of downsizing, no one with any memory of the past is still around. And too many organisations, too often, find themselves repeating mistakes made in the past and not advancing themselves at all. And furthermore, because employees are often encouraged nowadays to narrowly focus on achieving the objectives of their immediate project, they're often less creative in helping their overall organisation grow and flourish. Older workers are often perceived as being set in their ways and less creative than the young. If this is true, and often it simply isn't, it's more often a reflection of an organisational culture which considers anyone with grey hair as being past it, rather than a reflection on the capacity of the older worker. These comments apply as much to government and education organisations, but there are also some particular productivity-related issues which apply in these two special types of organisations. The definition of productivity for government departments has changed, at least in the developed world, while in some parts of the world the notion that a government department has increased productivity when it has provided a more effective community service still exists. In much of the developed world, the definition is likely to be a much more corporate one. In Australia, productivity improvements in government are most often related to measures like outputs per employee or client contacts per dollar invested. Such measures are likely to be very familiar to those in for-profit corporations, but they would not even have existed in public service 30 years ago. I've found that a similar situation exists in many of the educational institutions that I have visited. The definitions of productivity are slowly becoming indistinguishable from measures used in the corporate world. We've just recently had somewhat of a scandal in Australia with reports that our university professors are being pressured to pass full fee-paying students whether or not they've achieved the relevant educational standard. Of course, the universities deny that this happens, but at the same time they acknowledge how dependent they are becoming on corporate donations and sponsorship. I have no objection to rigorous, measurable, accounting type measures of productivity in their place. Much of what is done in the public service and inside institutions of learning does not lend itself to being measured in these relatively simplistic ways. I will have more to say, particularly about productivity in education later. But first, I'd like to say something about creativity. Creativity is an important aspect of productivity at work, and one that is often overlooked in organisations which are increasingly managed through position descriptions and key performance indicators. In an attempt to ensure that no one ever makes a mistake, many organisations put an overemphasis on rules and procedures, which ends up constraining creativity and productivity. I learned the folly of this approach thanks to a very wise mentor when I worked in the Ford Motor Company more than 20 years ago. At the time, I was a very junior employee, responsible for the organisation of an apprentice award night. And I was in the office of the most senior manufacturing executive responsible for multi-million-dollar production facilities. while we were talking, his phone rang and he put it on loudspeaker. It was the Managing Director of Ford Australia, who began by very aggressively asking Mr. Devison what the hell he'd done this time. During the next 20 minutes, it became clear that Mr. Devison had been required to spend $250,000 moving some critical equipment twice because the first location he'd chosen was inappropriate. The Managing Director was quite angry and he became very personal in his comments, but Mr. Devison made no attempt to have me leave the room. Eventually, the call ended with a sincere apology from Mr. Devison, who admitted he'd made a mistake, and when the call ended, he turned off the phone and casually returned to our conversation. I was quite shaken by the call, and I asked him how he could take such accusations so calmly. Then he did something I will never forget. He put his arms behind his head, leaned back in his chair and said, "Charles, who would you rather be? Someone who does 5 things a year and gets 4 of them right, or someone who does 100 things a year and gets 80 of them right? Both have an 80% success rate." "I accept that I will get some things wrong," he said, "but that doesn't stop me doing things." Mr. Devison was right. The more things we do, the more mistakes we will make. But we will also get more things right. The real productivity improvements still to be made at work involve letting people make mistakes, so long as they and their organisations learn from them. To stay with this point just one moment longer, another important consequence of management without mistakes is the tendency for nothing to be done until everyone agrees that it's a good idea, or, to be cynical, until everyone has found someone else to blame if it doesn't go as planned. Paralysis by analysis, as this is sometimes called, afflicts not only organisations but whole societies, and it is a very bad mistake. As another of my wise mentors often says, we must never let the perfect become the enemy of the good. Too often, while we search diligently for a perfect answer, we actually do nothing, which is very often worse than doing something which most people would have been happy with some time ago. This leads me to the last of my themes today, the relationship between productivity and learning. As Dick Bolles will elaborate in a moment, one of the very clear trends in the world of work is the increasing expectation that every employee will take responsibility for managing their own career. This is a huge shift in just the past 30 years or so. No longer is anyone promised an ongoing job, let alone a career, just because they've completed a trade qualification or a university degree. Success in the modern world of work requires a commitment by us all to lifelong learning. There is so much I could say about the implications of this simple sentence, but I'd like to focus here mostly on the organisational consequences, including those for institutions of education and learning. First, I want to draw a clear distinction between teaching and learning. Teaching, which is still the focus of too many of our educational institutions, even in the 21st century, is the process by which wise minds decide what less wise minds need to know and then run courses to increase their knowledge. In other words, teaching is driven by teachers. If you're in the teaching business, you might increase your productivity by getting your teachers to run more courses, or to reduce the time it takes to teach each course, or to increase the number of students in each course. These are all things which managers inside organisations in the teaching business might be relatively easily able to implement. Learning, on the other hand, is driven by learners who first identify what it is they need to know or understand and then seek to find it out. Often, though not always, they may engage the services of wiser minds to help them in this search, but always on the learner's, not the teacher's terms. Being in the learning business is quite different from being in the teaching business, in exactly the same way as being in the customer service business is different from being in the product supply business. Learning businesses are driven by the needs of the learners, not the teachers. And increasing productivity requires getting closer to learners and better understanding their needs. Being more productive in a learning business comes from being more efficient in the use of the learner's time, from wasting less of their time and getting them more quickly to where they want to be. When I talk of a learning business, I'm not only thinking of formal institutions of learning, universities, technical colleges and the like. It is true that the shift from teaching to learning has profound implications for these institutions. But there is just as much relevance here for every organisation, large and small. There are limits to the productivity improvements which can be directed by those at the top of the organisation, the teachers. The real productivity improvements, which remain to be made in most of the business world, will only come when those throughout the organisation are freed up to creatively explore and to get what they need to be better at what they do. Technology has brought productivity improvements of perhaps 3% per year in recent years in the United States alone. Freeing up employees to become true learners could easily double this. There is a huge opportunity here for all organisations to improve both their performance as a company and their relationships with their employees. The benefits are simply too large to ignore. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Let us begin now the first question and answer session. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Therefore, we ask that only one question be asked per phone call and that these questions be as brief as possible. You may call the studio directly at the phone numbers or fax which appear on your screen, and we remind you to make your calls at a distance from the monitor to assist in avoiding feedback. Thank you. And our first question today comes to us from the Federación Nacional de Comerciantes in Medellín, Colombia. And your question, please.
Muy buenos días. Our question is the following. Loyalty and productivity are in direct relationship with identification of objectives, of the organizational objectives. How can the company integrate their goals to the personal goals of its collaborators, constituents, or employees and other associates?
Very good. We're going to, as an excellent question, we're going to go to Charles on this one.
In many ways, I think this is the critical question that we all have to address. In this modern competitive world, we're increasingly told that it is the success of the organisation that is the most critical, and that what the organisation needs to do is to get its employees aligned with its corporate goals. Well, I think the other side of that equation is just as important, and it's critical for individuals to say our needs are important too, and that organisations actually change themselves a little to accommodate their employees. This is just not the way in which the world is heading, but it seems to me the only way to bring genuine loyalty into play, which is trust both ways.
Dick, brief follow-up on that?
Well, I think that it's important for the companies or the organizations to get to know what the skills and talents are of their individual employees before they can do that task of integrating their goals with the employees. I know one place where they needed a pilot. They didn't even know that one of their employees was a pilot.
Yeah, very good. Take those surveys. And our next question comes to us today from the Technological University in Tecamachalco in Pueblo, Mexico. And the question, please. Thank you.
All right. The question is the following. We know that every human being is creative, and they do that in their jobs. But how can we actually detect that they are really doing this, that we're really tapping their creativity? How can we implement a learning process, and how can we actually stimulate and motivate these creative people for them to really perform creativity in their jobs, and then that would be contributing to a regional work, so the actual contribution of creative people and how to tap that creativity for the benefit of the whole region? That's the question.
I think there's a parachute in there somewhere, Dick.
Me parece que en algún lugar.
Maybe you can take this one as a starter.
Well, I think it's important for the companies to help the employees to identify their own skills and their own gifts. It's not always necessary to assume that the employees know what they are. And I know one company that used to have classes on one day of the week at work where they helped the employees to figure out what their skills were and their gifts, and I think this is crucial.
Can I also say, Dan, that I think there's an issue here which one researcher has described as being simultaneously loose-tight in your organisation structure. Most organisations are encouraged today to believe that in order to be competitive, they've got to be very tight-knit and very tightly focused. It's very difficult, if you're focused that tightly, to actually free people up to be creative. So somehow you've got to give people the space to demonstrate the skills that Dick's talking about and to demonstrate how creative they can be in helping the organisation create its objectives.
Does that also include the ability to make mistakes and recover from them?
Well, as I tried to say in my presentation, I think the ability to make mistakes is critical. There's a wonderful story told about IBM many years ago about a man who was called into Thomas Watson Sr.'s office after a huge financial error, and he walked up to his desk and said, "Here's my resignation letter," and Tom Watson said, "Resign? What are you doing that for?" And he said, "Well, I just wanted to save you sacking me." He said, "I wasn't going to sack you. Why would I do that?" He said, "I've just spent $10 million educating you." I think that's the issue.
Very good. Thank you. Good stories. We're going to take a question now from the Colegio de Bachilleres in Sinaloa, Guasave, Mexico.
Good morning. Buenos días. Buenos días. Adelante, Sinaloa. Good morning. The following question comes from the state of Sinaloa. If loyalty is a commitment that the employee has toward his bosses, what strategies do you suggest that for the unionized personnel to be more productive for the personal benefit and for the benefit of the organization? Thank you.
Thank you. Very good question. And Charles, I know you've had some experience in this world, so let's go to you.
Yes, this I think is another critical issue. Unions around the world have by and large developed in order to protect individual rights against the oppressive boss. And in that sort of an environment, it's very difficult to have a concept of loyalty. So I think there's a need for both bosses and unions to redefine and reinvent themselves. First of all, bosses need to realise that being oppressive isn't very helpful. But unions, I think, need to realise that perhaps their role is more as an ombudsman or a facilitator rather than a protector. And in that case, what they can bring to their experience at the workplace is their experience with many other employers. The union official works in many different organisations in different ways, and he can bring that to the workplace and help the relationship between the individual employer and employee if he looks at himself as a facilitator rather than a protector.
Just a brief yes, no, are we going to see more unionization, more issues in the global workforce?
Well, this is one of those cleft stick things. You look at companies like Amazon in America that I've just seen have laid some people off, and part of the fear is because they're attempting to unionise, so there still seems to be a fear about increasing unionisation. On the other hand, in my country, where unions have started to develop more of this facilitator role, they are regaining a place in the workplace. So I think it comes down to the role they play.
Okay. Very good. Thank you, Charles. We would like to take our next question from Cedopex, Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic.
From Santo Domingo, the Center Cedopex, we are greeting you, and our question is the following. In an environment where the only real constants are change and aggressiveness from the competition that forces the company to reduce costs and in order to be more efficient, how can we really have loyalty, and how can we integrate personnel who really knows that they will be the victims of the next adjustment plan or the next streamlining process?
Very good. I think that there are issues for both of you here, but Charles, go ahead.
Yeah, we see this every day, and I hear this every day, that organisations need to cut costs in order to be more competitive. I think that's just the first strategy, and I think if you look at some businesses that have been through this a few times, they've realised that cutting costs only gets you so far. And in fact, another way of becoming more competitive is to become more productive. And you don't do that necessarily by having the smallest number of people. You do it by employing all of the skills and resources of people. So I think one answer to this question is to have some organisations shift away from this cost-cutting mentality into looking at how they can actually be more productive and more creative and achieve their goals.
Dick, you see some issues of change and loyalty with people changing.
Yeah, there was a factory owner whose factory burned down several years ago in the U.S., and he supported his employees all during the time it took to rebuild the factory. And that was an example so newsworthy. It was featured in magazines, newspapers, on the radio, TV, and so on. But we do need more of that. Even if it's so unusual that it becomes news, we still need to see more replication of that.
Very good. Thank you, gentlemen. The question comes to us from the Universidad Tecnológica in Panama, and if we may have the question, please.
Muy bien, adelante. What kind of structure, organizational structure, promotes the most creativity? Thank you.
Wow, that's a good one. I like that a lot. So, since you're laughing, Charles, we'll go to you.
Gee. One of my favourite authors is an American philosopher called Ken Wilber. And Ken Wilber has termed the phrase holarchy as a way of getting away from the old traditional notion of a hierarchy. Most organisations today are built around the idea